So in closing today's session, I'd like to speak to you about a perspective shift. A shift that many companies and scholars that you've heard from this afternoon have already made. A shift toward taking a more holistic view of sustainability and sustainable development. And for lack of innovative genius on my part, I'm just going to call that Sustainability 2.0 for the purposes of this talk. Now, what do I mean by perspective shift? Well, take your average college student. I'm sure you all are familiar with this sort of example. There's a distinctive difference between the attitude with which a college student approaches something that they have to do and something that they really want to do. The former, my experience, and I'm sure with yours as well, tends to encourage a narrow, check the box and move on quickly mindset, sort of a compliance obligation mindset. Whereas the latter encourages more creativity and innovation. Not always, but often. And this difference in attitude is, in a deep way, analogous to the perspective shift towards Sustainability 2.0 that I'll be speaking to you about today. Now, I'd like to apologize in advance to the scholars in the room and to people in business who have much more experience. This is by no means meant to be a fully consistent framework or a paradigm. My main thought was to try to synthesize the themes that arose in today's session and see if I can leave you with core intuition, right? Not some equations, not some concepts to memorize, but a core intuition that a week, a year, right, 2 years from now, when you or your organization is faced with a key decision to make, you'll remember in a gut sense, this is what Sustainability 2.0 means. And the crux of this intuition has to do with moving away from thinking about sustainability as a compliance obligation and toward thinking about sustainability as a core value proposition. Okay, so how am I going to do that? I'm going to go about this talk by way of 3 companies, 2 pieces of economics, and 1 short story. Let me start with a short story. So, growing up, I thought I wanted to be an ecologist, like the great E.O. Wilson. Nothing made me happier than catching bugs and frogs and butterflies out in nature. Nothing made me angrier than reading about the destruction of the Amazon rainforest or the destabilization of our climate. And in my early childhood's worldview, I had a sense, a very strong sense, that the economy and the environment were very separate, very separate. And that current economic growth was unsustainable because of big, bad businesses. That was my early worldview. And in fact, my grandfather, before he passed away, used to tell a story of how we'd be driving through the heart of Busan, which is where all of my family is from. And I was maybe 5 years old, and I'd sort of be looking out the window and sulking, give a big sigh, and say, "Grandpa, I wish I had been born 100 years ago, before all this stupid development." Well, little did I know that my grandfather was a businessman himself, and that he'd worked tirelessly his entire life to make this stupid development possible, so that my father and I could get an education overseas. 그땐 제가 그걸 좀 많이 몰랐습니다. But in college, I was lucky enough to meet a professor who helped me shift my perspective on this issue. Professor Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia was one of many who showed me that sustainable and development were not necessarily at odds. That is, if you take a holistic view of what sustainability means, something that should have been obvious all along becomes clear. That sustainable and development in the long run have to go hand in hand. And the core piece of that is this concept of social value creation and and the role that companies can play in social value creation. So that was my perspective shift. All right, first company, Walmart. You all know about Walmart. Walmart is a big company. It is the second largest private employer in the world. It has one of the largest distribution networks ever created in the history of man. Walmart's annual fuel costs alone are $8 billion. So in the mid-2000s, Walmart's CEO and his team realized that by making our trucking fleet a little bit more sustainable, right, by improving our fuel efficiency by 2 or 3%, we could save hundreds of millions of dollars. And they did. And Walmart received many awards, and you see articles in the Harvard Business Review talking about Walmart as a green champion. Fine. But even in this example, Walmart's sustainability success story, to me, sustainability is still somewhat peripheral. It is not part of Walmart's core value proposition. So what do I mean by that? Let's do this diagram a couple of times. Walmart was able to achieve sustainability success by addressing what was essentially a peripheral support operation, namely transportation fuel efficiency. Its core value proposition, which is low-cost retail, didn't really change. It just so happened that because of the way in which Walmart's business is structured, because its fuel costs were $8 billion a year, 2 or 3 percentage points of increased sustainability on that margin led to hundreds of millions of dollars of cost savings. And nothing about their core value proposition necessarily changed. And in that sort of narrow Walmart sense of sustainability, the Sustainability 1.0 sense, almost everyone, you don't need an MBA to know that sustainability is an issue. In fact, according to a recent BCG report, 70% of all CEOs responded that sustainability is an important issue for management. Fine. But in what form? In what form? To too many CEOs, sustainability still means more CFL light bulbs, more electricity efficiency, better waste management, more recycling, and corporate social responsibility, donations, right? This is all the stuff that you see in the glossy company sustainability reports. But the companies that are on the leading edge, that get sustainability 2.0, or in the innovation frontier, they understand that sustainability really in the long run is deeper than that. These are the companies that take a wider view of what sustainability means. And they understand that this holistic view of sustainability takes into account the following. It takes into account how global sustainability challenges, like climate change, like world food supply, like health issues, such as obesity that Dr. El-Sayed spoke to you about earlier, how these issues affect and are affected by the company's core value proposition. In effect, the extent to which the company's core value proposition relates to and addresses social needs. Okay, so let me tell you about a company that gets this, company number 2. Can someone in the audience, without checking their smartphone or looking up in your laptop, tell me what the 2013 US Car of the Year was? Anyone? Not from the SNST? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't made by BMW or Mercedes or Hyundai or Kia, unfortunately. It was essentially made by a clean energy startup. It's the Tesla Model S. What's the Tesla Model S? It is a luxury electric vehicle. It is a fully electric car, not a hybrid, that can go 250 miles on each charge and can accelerate faster than most sports cars. Okay. Now, 10 years ago, when nobody thought that a fully electric vehicle would be profitable, much less a luxury electric vehicle, the CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk, and his team understood that by positioning their innovative genius and technical skills to address a social problem, namely the problem of climate change, they could create both social value and profit from it. And again, it wasn't by addressing peripheral support operations in a sustainable way that they profited. It was by aligning their core value proposition, which is essentially a luxury electric car, which can, if the grid supports it, have zero carbon emissions, right? As their core value proposition. So I'm not an expert financial analyst, but let me just tell you that apparently investors in the global stock market think that Tesla's idea is a good one. Tesla's stock value has jumped, has quadrupled in the last 2 years. Okay, company number 3, GE, another company that you are familiar with. Now, in the early 2000s, what stood out about GE as a company was that it was old, unwieldy, and increasingly outdated. You know, some media pundits were arguing that it was becoming a dinosaur and facing extinction. CEO Jeff Immelt looked at the situation and thought to himself, okay, what do we do? Well, I know that in the future, no matter what happens, resources will become scarcer. And so as a technology company, maybe what we can do is align all of our operations such that they address this resource scarcity. Because we're good at creating high-tech devices. Why don't we create high-tech devices that can address resource scarcity? So what did he do? He started Eco-Imagination, which basically leveraged the power of networks and social media and crowdsourced innovation from hundreds of thousands of individuals, researchers, and scientists around the world. Eco-Imagination open platform received over 4,000 business proposals from 75,000 groups in the first 3 years. Okay, so why did this work for GE? Well, again, they were prescient enough to think holistically about sustainability and anticipated a shift in scarcity. And in doing so, they engaged in social value creation. And once again, it wasn't a matter of peripheral support operations becoming more sustainable, it was their core value proposition. Okay. All right, first piece of economics. Again, I apologize to the real economists in the room, I'm hand-waving a couple of things here. But in the long run, and to a rough approximation, the market value of a product will roughly be equivalent to the true social value of that product. Namely, the true social value, which includes not only private consumption value, which is the willingness to pay in the value stick model that you saw yesterday, but also includes scarcity value for society and excludes or minuses out negative external social costs. So true social value equals private consumption value plus scarcity value minus external costs, minus negative externalities. Okay? Let me give you some examples to plant this intuition. Let's talk about cigarettes for a second. Again, something that Dr. Alsea spoke to earlier. Is the true social value of a pack of cigarettes 2,500 won? Probably not. The true social value is probably negative, right? Because of all of the adverse health consequences, the negative external costs of smoking on society. And that's actually why, when you saw on Abdul's table, the countries that had high cigarette prices and low cigarette smoking, well, what happened there, country governments put in a penalty, a cigarette tax, a tobacco tax, which essentially equalized, right, the market value to true social value by forcing the consumer and the producer to pay a penalty to smoke. If that math doesn't make sense in your head, I can talk to you afterward. Give you another example. What about a bottle of water? Maybe 1,000 won for each of these bottles of water here. In the future, or maybe even today, but especially in the future with climate change and water scarcity, the true social value of that bottle of water is probably not 1,000 won. It's probably much higher than that. And in the long run, this will become included in the market value of that product. And it's not just about drinking water, right? It's not just about the water consumption itself. It's about all of the related services, purification, transportation, desalination, that we'll see a rise in market premium with this scarcity value included in the market value. Now, as businesses, you know that if you can sell something for a certain amount, I've tried to convince you that in the long run you can sell any good or service for its true social value. Right here, if you can produce that thing at less than the true social value, you can make a profit. Basically. And again, the key intuition that I'd like to try to stress is that by thinking about sustainability holistically, as managers, you may be able to increasingly see the fundamentals behind these trends and unlock a source of profit potential that you may not have thought about before. Again, Tesla understood that the negative externality cost of carbon and other fossil fuels will eventually, and actually is already, be internalized into the cost of a car. And so that all else being equal, a luxury automobile that runs on electricity will be worth more than a luxury automobile that runs on oil. Similarly, GE understood that as water scarcity went up, the social value of water would increase, and therefore all the services associated with water would increase and become more profitable for them. Now, that raises an interesting question for businesses and policymakers. Well, what are the sources? What are the possible sources of externality value, social value creation along this logic that you might see in the future? Well, Dr. Alsea mentioned smoking. Maybe there's a market for smoking cessation devices in Korea. But what about the obesity epidemic? Maybe there is room to position yourself as a provider of cheap but healthy food products, right, that create social value in this sense. Or what about accident fatalities? It wasn't on the top 10 list of fatalities for Dr. Alsea, but it's definitely a gut-wrenching issue. And it's essentially a technical problem that can be solved by smart engineers, I imagine. And finally, a bigger question of how will we retrofit our cities to become more sustainable in the future, and especially with respect to climate adaptation. These are issues that have immense social value, getting into them. Okay. Well, what I've told you is sort of the long run, and it requires a key piece of government intervention that I'll talk about in a second. Some of you may be less patient and may want to know, well, what about the short run? What about today? Well, it turns out that there are at least two different ways in which a company can profit from sustainability right now, even without talking about the long-run government support. And this is from Professor Jeffrey Hill. One is consumer-led, the other is investor-led. Okay. Consumer-led is the following. Consumer-led is when you recognize the fact that consumers are often willing to pay a substantial price premium for a product that they know is sustainably produced. So let me give you, instead of giving you an anecdotal example, let me give you an empirical research paper that some folks at Harvard recently did on this issue. So Hiscock and Smith teamed up with a major department store in New York City and did the following experiment. They took 2 sets of towels, both of which were sustainably and organically produced. Okay, 2 different sets of towels, but both sustainably and organically produced, but not labeled as such before. And they put a sustainably produced label like that on one set of them, and no label on the other. And they tracked relative, sales from the same store over the next several months. So you can know that this is a causal impact of the label and nothing else. Okay. Well, over the next 3 months, relative sales of the one with the towels with the label went up by 10%. Not that surprising, it's interesting. But what's interesting is that they went back and actually raised the prices of the one with the label by 10%. After which point, the sales of that set of towels actually increased by more, by 33% over several months. And they went back and did that again with a 20% price increase, and the sales went up by 41%. And they were able to replicate this result with not only towels, but with candles, with rugs, and several other items in this store. Now, what does this study tell us? It tells us that consumers, again, in some segments at least, are willing to pay a significant price premium for goods that they know and can trust were sustainably produced. And it's quite likely that the price increase, the price discrepancy, was a signal to the consumer that they can actually trust that this was sustainably produced. Now, many of you may be familiar with the term SRI investing, or socially responsible investing. This is when investors, professional investors, take non-financial metrics into account when they invest in a particular company. Now, you may be familiar with the term, you may not be familiar with the magnitude of this asset class. I was surprised when I saw these numbers. As of 2012, 3.74 trillion in assets in the US were invested according to SRI principles. That's roughly 13% of all professionally managed investments in the United States. Or, to put those numbers into context, that's 3 times Korea's annual GDP, or 10 times the size of Korea's national pension service. Pretty big. Now that number may actually be an underestimate, because many state and local pensions, as well as university endowments, also invest according to some notion of social value creation. And so if you include those investment funds, the figure is actually around 30 to 40% of all US, professionally managed US investments made according to some notion of social value creation. Now, it isn't that these investors are not seeking returns. In fact, it's the opposite. They think that because standard financial accounting requirements miss important components of holistic social value creation, by looking at other metrics, sustainability metrics, they think they can identify the companies that will achieve higher returns for them on a pure dollars and cents basis. Okay. Those are the 2 ways you can profit today, but let me talk about the long term, because the long term is what's really important. I told you that in the long run, the true social value and the market value of a product will be roughly equivalent. There's a key step there. That step involves government and social enterprises or civil society. That is, the business cannot do it alone. It requires the government to set the rules of the economic game such that it is profitable in the long run for a company to produce goods and services that have positive social value, so not producing cigarettes. Right? So the examples of what government can do include tobacco taxes or carbon markets. So the good news here is that Korea, starting in 2015, will have one of the world's largest and most stringent cap-and-trade programs for carbon regulation in the world. That's a strong signal that helps businesses know that in the future they will be able to profit, right, from becoming more sustainable in this more holistic sense of the term. Okay. But here's the key point. That caveat aside, all the action will have to be in the private sector for all the reasons that Dr. El-Sayed and many others on these panels have mentioned. Businesses are where the innovation occurs. Right? So the action on this front, in the short and the long run, will be in the private sector. And that action will begin, I'd like to argue, with a perspective shift. So to summarize, this perspective shift to me from Sustainability 1.0 to Sustainability 2.0 is a perspective shift from thinking about sustainability as a peripheral compliance obligation thing that you have to do even though you don't want to. To sustainability as something that can be part of a core value proposition, something that you really want to do. Now, my question for you as you leave today is this: have you made this shift? And I think, judging from the conversations we've had during the sessions and outside, the answer is probably yes, or at least in the process thereof. And so let me end with a quote from Albert Einstein, who says that you can't solve a problem by using the same level of thinking that created the problem in the first place. humanity is going to require a substantially new way of thinking if it's going to survive. Now, I'm optimistic that humanity will survive, and I think many on the SNS team and on the panel would agree. But I would argue that, in large part, it will require this perspective shift. And nothing excites me more than working together to turn this perspective shift into action.